Hello, everyone. My name is Ingrid Timboe. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, or AGWA. And I'm here today with two of my colleagues, John Matthews, our Executive Director, and Georgette McCarty-Keene, who is our comms advisor. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the Paris Agreement, water's role in it. But first, maybe just a couple words about AGWA, and then I will also let my colleagues introduce themselves as well. So AGWA was founded, 15 plus years ago now, John? And it's a global members network of a few thousand of us around the world who work at the intersection of climate change and water resources management. So there's kind of a technical side where we look at more kind of what we call bottom-up approaches to climate adaptation. So looking at how climate change is affecting how water is managed at local levels, and then connecting it to our policy work, which is maybe sometimes a little bit more top-down, where we work with the UNFCCC and groups at national and global levels to kind of integrate some of that technical learning into policy realms. So that's why we're here today, because we have been working on water and climate change since our founding, and in John's case, for years before our founding as well. So maybe with that, John, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. John Matthews. I'm based in Oregon on the Pacific coast of the US. I'm the executive director and one of the two founders of AGWA. And I'm a resilient scientist by training and orientation, and also a practitioner in that space. And I felt a little compelled and drawn, maybe sometimes against my will, even into the policy space. My first UNFCCC COP was Copenhagen, COP 15 in 2009.
Yes, a veteran in in the climate policy wars, with the scars to prove it, no doubt. Georgette, do you want to say hello?
Yes, hello, my name's Georgette. I'm based here in New York, but I'm from the UK originally. And I've been working with AGWA on the communications for the last couple of years. And today I'll be asking Ingrid and John some questions to delve a little bit further into that policy that Ingrid knows so well and John reluctantly has stepped into as well.
Brilliant. Maybe just before we get started, apologies that we can't be there in person, that we're recording this at a time zone that is a little bit more friendly, because this presentation would be much poorer if you were getting us at 3 or 4 a.m. Our time. So apologies again that we're doing this as a pre-record, but also just to say, happy to follow up with anybody if anyone has any questions. I'm sure our contact information will be shared. And our colleague, Danny Gaillard-Pichet, who's based in France, will hopefully be joining the Q&A section live, so she can help answer any questions that you might have about the topics that we're covering today. Thanks. Georgette?
Yes, so let's I'll start with you, Ingrid. If you can give us as short an overview as you can of water's role in the Paris Agreement, both as it relates to mitigation, but also adaptation goals.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might have heard this before, but have kind of famously or infamously, I guess, depending on your perspective, the word water is actually never mentioned in the Paris Agreement. But if you actually dive into the Paris Agreement itself in the various different articles as they relate to mitigation, adaptation, just transition, etc., water is actually deeply embedded within a lot of this work, both the articles 2 with the temperature goal, Article 4 on mitigation, and then, of course, most strongly, Article 7 on the global goal on adaptation, which is designed to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability. And so while, again, water isn't directly mentioned, it is so important to actually meeting our goals. So when it comes to, on the mitigation side of things, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, water plays a big role, not only in the green energy transition, so in a lot of the types of green energy that countries are notably utilizing, including hydropower or also various different types of emission reductions activities, as well as different activities related to biofuels, etc. There are a number of water components there directly. And so water has a big impact there, but also indirectly. When we think about electricity generation more broadly, water is widely used in electricity generation. And so we need to be considering how water fits into our energy transition goals and commitments under the Paris Agreement. And also on the adaptation side, water is very critical to whether it's to our food security, whether it's to our energy security, as also already mentioned, and then of course to water security as well. So as we're thinking about a kind of broad range of activities under the Paris Agreement, water shows up again and again. And also with the concept of just transition, so ensuring that the most vulnerable communities among us are considered first when we're looking at these energy transition plans or when we're looking at our food security transition plans, ensuring that those activities aren't going to increase vulnerability or increase insecurity for those communities, those frontline communities, considering water there is really important. So that's kind of a very high level overview of kind of how water fits directly in the Paris Agreement. And then it comes into the negotiations over time as well, as we've been thinking about things like the global stocktake that happens every 5 years of looking at actual action on the ground. You see water come into play there, and you see it also in the specific commitments related called nationally determined contributions, NDCs, or NAPs, National Adaptation Plans.
Amazing. And John, as a veteran of these meetings, how have you seen water's role in the Paris Agreement, but also maybe since developing a little, which Ingrid touched upon as well, that its role has changed and grown?
Absolutely. And this is the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And water's really changed significantly over that period. When you go to the COPs there's a little bit of circus atmosphere there. There's a small series of rooms where negotiations are happening, the kind of direct negotiations, but there's lots of things that are kind of happening in the sides, often kind of quiet deals that are being worked out. Plus, there's also just the events that are happening in they could be like official side events and plenary events, uh, events that are occurring in the pavilions. And over the long period that I've been going to COPs, water has been kind of seeping in from the edges. Literally, the first kind of major water event that I'm aware of that happened at COP was in Cancun. That was in 2010. It was organized with the World Bank, with AGWA, and it was quite literally 20 kilometers from the COP site. Water had to be brought in by a mule train or maybe some Roman aqueduct to the COP facility site. Uh, it's been kind of quietly present, but I think of the main reason is that our understanding about climate change on both the mitigation and the adaptation side has really evolved over time. We started to see, like in Peru, the Lima COP, uh, uh, some water themed events. The Paris COP, actually, the French government, along with AGWA and SIWI, some other groups, organized a small side event that probably marks the kind of first attempt at a real water day in a COP, at least in an informal way, and really focusing on especially the central connection between water and and adaptation resilience. And but even then, I think the kind of larger narrative that we've seen happen is water started off being talked about mostly as just a hazard. It's a threat. It's a negative impact. It's floods and droughts. Those have to be among the most common words that you hear at COP constantly. Uh, but I think the big insight that's happened is in the climate community is that not only is water a source of hazards, it's source of most of our hazards. In fact, on the land surface, um, but it's also the source of most of our effective solutions, and that it is a medium for resilience. And that's a really big transition. It's not completed yet. It's one where there's a lot of variation that remains, but I think that's the most significant change.
Maybe just to complement that with one other thing, there's also, so that kind of process that John has been mentioning on the kind of global climate action side of things, this kind of groundswell that's happened around water, primarily pushed by the global water community to be more engaged, to be more involved, to act, to activate like these actual water days starting in Marrakesh. That then transitioned over to the negotiation side at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So that was 2022, where we actually got water mentioned multiple times in the outcome decision. And that was the first time that we had kind of seen that groundswell transition over to the negotiation side, and it's pretty much been maintained since that time. That was only a couple years ago, but then last year we got the Baku Declaration on Water for Climate Change, and now we have a standing Baku dialogue on water that is supposed to take this forward from COP to COP. We'll see how that's actually going to be taken forward. But the idea then is that there is kind of this official place for water in the process, which has never existed before. So that would be, again, very exciting for us. But what I think John is speaking to also, there's this larger understanding of water's central role by countries as well, because they are grappling with all of these impacts, these floods and droughts that we hear about. They're experiencing them all the time now, and it's really front and center of their minds as they're coming to COP and thinking not only about what are their new commitments, but how are they actually going to implement them.
I totally agree with that. Something that occurred to me. I'd come back from Paris. I was back home. It'd been a really intensive COP, and I was watching the final ceremony for the signing event on my sofa. Really tired that day, um, and I remember thinking, this convention, like the Paris Agreement, it is the very first true global water agreement. It just doesn't mention water, as Ingrid said, because the sweeping nature of the impacts of climate policy in terms of how we think about energy, carbon sequestration, how we think about adaptation resilience, really fundamentally changing our vision about what economic development should be. Those are mostly water decisions, not everything, but almost all of it is it touches on changes in how we think about water. And in that sense, I think it was a real loss that the Paris Agreement didn't call out water. We almost need a kind of a 2.0 version that more formally recognizes that special role that water has in terms of implementation. But I think it's really important. And maybe the very last point I'll make there is that uh, I actually think that it's not just like water people should be sitting around smugly thinking like we have these three solutions and we just need to hand them off to the climate community. Actually, it's climate change is, or at least should be having, I think, a similar scale of impact on how we think about water management, about water resources, as in the same way that the water is having these profound impacts on the climate community and climate decisions.
And yeah, so while the water wasn't mentioned within the Paris Agreement, there is obviously the core commitments to the goals that are set there in the shape of the country's NDCs and NAPs, which are the commitments, and then how to implement what to implement to achieve those commitments. How has water seeped or not seeped its way into those commitments and plans, and how is that impacting then how those plans are financed, or how they link to other aspects of the sort of commitments that are made at COP, for example, looking at things like a just transition?
Yeah, so for COP 30 is a big NDC year. So it's when the third round of NDCs are due. So countries should have already made their commitments. Nepal has made its NDC 3.0, and so that is out there, and it's very strong on water, which is excellent to see. But we really see, John was kind of alluding to it already in his answer. We see an evolution of how water has been mentioned over time. Now that we're at the third round, we can look back. There was even before the first NDC, there was what was called the INDC, or the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution. That came just after Paris. And then since then, we've had these progressively more ambitious commitments that have been made. And so we can actually track the progress of water over that time. And what we do see is that there is a more nuanced view of water, particularly on the adaptation side, where I think we still have a really long way to go on the mitigation side. And to be clear, NDCs are primarily, although not only primarily, about mitigation. Countries are actually not required to include an adaptation component in their NDC, although the vast majority of them do. But primarily the NDCs are about how we are going to meet the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement by 2050. And so it's really about GHG reductions primarily. Although even there, that has changed and evolved kind of over time. And so on the mitigation side, I would say that water's important role is not yet as well recognized as it is on the adaptation side. You're starting to see it come up more often, particularly when it comes to very water intensive activities like a hydropower system or like biofuels, for example, somewhat on kind of the nature-based solutions, sequestration side of things. So looking at things like wetlands for primarily methane, but also other GHG emissions and sequestration. So that kind of side of things, you're seeing water a little bit, but really on the adaptation side, that's where it's really taken off. Nearly all of the commitments, all of the NDCs that include adaptation include water as a priority sector. But critically, at AGWA and within the global water and climate community, we are really looking for how is water included more systemically rather than just as kind of a sectoral issue. And you do see that evolving over time. So you do see more attention paid to the water energy nexus, to water and food systems, also to other kind of more broad sustainable development targets and goals. And then also obviously to disaster risk reduction as well for those countries that include those components in their NDCs. And maybe the last thing that I would say about that is the reason that this moment with this round of NDCs is really important, because we haven't had a way thus far. So the global goal on adaptation was in the Paris Agreement. It is in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, but there weren't any, it wasn't further elaborated. And so now we are going to get at this COP, hopefully, a new set of indicators to track and monitor progress on the GGA going forward. And there's a whole set of indicators that have been proposed on water. And so that is really important, because those indicators will be used with these NDCs for the first time. So there will have to be a connection between these NDCs and the indicators that are going to be negotiated at COP30. And so we will see this round of NDCs more specifically target these sets of issues that are under the indicators for the GGA. So that's going to be really interesting to kind of watch and see how parties kind of grapple with that going forward.
Two of the big topics, especially in recent years, have been around finance and around mobilizing finance and allocating it and distributing it fairly, as well as a just transition. And occasionally those two things are linked together. We've both touched upon it a little bit, that water can feed into both finance and looking at things in terms of mitigating emissions. What is the role that water can play in either or both finance and the just transition? How can maybe also touching upon what we could hope to expect at this COP specifically?
Again, I'm like a nerdy scientist that always feels a little bit like an outsider at these COPs, so I'm going to be opinionated. I think a lot of times the finance discussions are they sound off to me because especially the kind of UNFCCC or some of the other kind of presidency leadership, they often talk about these stratospheric goals that of these hundreds of billions that are going to be committed for climate finance. It's hard for me to relate that to actual projects, actually, and to actually changing things that are on the ground. What is that money for? Who is it coming from? I think it's to me we do need a vast amount of money to change our energy systems, and we need an even vaster amount of money to help our ecosystems and our communities and our economies be able to not just adjust to, but prepare for ongoing climate change. In that sense, these vast sums of money are actually profoundly inadequate. I feel like that's something that's an easy headline and just hard to relate to reality. The just transitions issue, though, is actually, I think, almost more poignant, and I think it is one that is much easier to relate to. I think that people in the climate community use the term just transition to often mean two different things. Its traditional definition, its traditional usage is how do uh, we recognize that we're making these big changes in our economy and in our society, the way that we're organizing ourselves because of climate change, and they're going to be winners and losers. So how do we help the communities, the individuals, the institutions that through no fault of their own, they're on the losing equation for that. And so look at an easy example there. What happens to coal miners? If we're really successful with an energy transition, then there shouldn't be any coal miners. But it's not coal miners' fault that we have carbon emissions. So how do we help them? How do we help those communities in which they live? And that's a real challenge, and it's not just coal, right? It's lots of parts of our economy. I think the other way.
Energy transition more broadly. I mean, it's just how do we can't say, oh, sub-Saharan Africa, you can't have electricity 24 hours a day, you can't have air conditioning. I mean, that's absurd. Of course,
Exactly.
they have to be able to have, these sorts of things. So it permeates, it's not even just specific sectors, it's
Yeah.
the entire economy. It's all parts of society.
That's exactly right. In that sense, it's not really surprising, for instance, that we're still doing carbon fossil fuel based new installations for energy systems. I think in the adaptation and resilience world, just transitions has a kind of secondary meaning that is also really important. Maybe to use your Sahel example, Ingrid, Sahel is moving, and it's if anything, it's moving south as the Sahara Desert gets bigger, and in a place uh, like the Hindu Kush, the kind of greater Himalayan area, or in the Andes, or the uh, the mountains of the Alps in Europe. Like these are also kind of obvious examples of ecosystems that, because of climate change, they're going through a pretty profound transition themselves. We're speaking literally hours before a Category 5 hurricane hits very late in the season, the island of Jamaica. And arguably, this is also an example of a very unjust transition that the climate is inflicting on these economies and communities and ecosystems.
Just to pile on the topic of finance very briefly, I will not offer a a rebuttal or defense, shall we say, of the climate finance discussion within the UNFCCC. Um, the big number that's going around now as of last year is the 1.3 trillion. Again, that kind of skyrocketing number, John. It is more about signaling. That is the idea with it. It is not to say that this is the quantum that is precisely needed. We know that it is actually quite a bit, the amount that's needed is quite a bit higher than that. But it is more about signaling the seriousness with which the developed countries, are taking on this responsibility, and they do use that term, responsibility, to support developing countries in managing the transition. Because these communities, like the Jamaica example, Jamaica did not contribute excessively to climate change, but they are feeling massive impacts from that. Colleagues in Nepal, similarly. And so it's really important, even though it's really challenging, and the numbers are almost just made up, basically. There was a lot of there was a lot of economic analysis that went into that number, so I don't want to say it's completely made up, but it's almost arbitrary, right? But it is meant to be a very large number that indicates the seriousness with which this is being taken forward. And so that's why developing countries, in particular, the different negotiating groups, go in so hard on the negotiations on this topic, because they feel so strongly, as well they should, that this is something that is needed to help their countries adapt and manage this transition. So that's all I will add, kind of on
Thank you
that.
for adding that, and you're absolutely right, and I didn't mean to suggest anything.
No.
Yeah.
And I agree. Like the discussions, if you follow the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG, maybe that's being discussed elsewhere in the discussion today. But if that is being, if that's something you're interested in following, it's very, very difficult. It's very challenging. And, I think we don't have time to go into it now, but there are ways that could have been handled differently that might have gone better. But whenever you have a big number that's out there, that's going to suck up all the energy in the room, and that's the unfortunate kind of part about it, is it becomes about that number instead of about what is actually happening, what are kind of people doing, what are we committing to, and everyone's just really focused on that number, and that kind of takes all the energy out of the room, which is really unfortunate. But I do think it's very important, specifically for developing countries, to keep this going.
So I think it's you'll both be there and following different processes and taking part in several events. But what are your hopes and predictions as well for the outcomes of this upcoming COP?
So in terms of actual negotiated outcomes, the larger negotiations, I am not particularly hopeful that water will make a big splash, apart from the global goal and adaptation negotiations. The finance conversation is going to dominate again this year because it was left partially unresolved, from last year. There are also a number of other the agenda for negotiators at COP30 is impossible. Spare a thought for our negotiators this year. The agenda that they have is impossible to get through. They will not get through everything because so much has been left over from last year. Last year was a really difficult set of negotiations. They will try and move forward on those global goal and global goal and adaptation indicators that I mentioned previously. And so that, and water does feature quite heavily there. Brazil, the COP presidency, each year the COP president tries to put its own stamp kind of on the negotiations. Brazil's big stamp this year is well, there are multiple levels, but one of the things that they're obviously very interested in is forests, and so they're trying to get through this giant forests package this year. Obviously, water plays a major role in that, but it will not probably most likely be featured heavily in the conversation there. And then obviously getting these new national commitments and looking at what the gap still remains. So basically they have to tally up all the new goals or all the new commitments and see how close that gets us to that 1.5 degree temperature goal, and then where the gap still remains. So there's going to be a lot of discussion around that. We should be getting this week, hopefully by the time this conversation airs, we will have the NDC synthesis report. It's supposed to come out tomorrow, very, very late, that will kind of give us some early indications of what those negotiations are going to look like. On the action agenda side, water will be very present. The water days under the presidency agenda are the first 2 days, the 10th and the 11th. So right out the gate, water is going to play a big role in the presidency events. There's a lot of things going on. As I mentioned, the Baku dialogue session, I believe it's scheduled on the 11th as of right now. So there will be the first meeting for that. And then a number of other events. And then, of course, the Water for Climate Pavilion will be back for the fourth time this year, right? And so, or fifth edition of the Water for Climate Pavilion will be happening this year. So there will be water events in the Blue Zone all throughout the 2 weeks of the conference. So, I think from an action agenda side, we're continuing to grow the momentum. Negotiations, again, will be primarily around finance this year, but I suspect that the GGA will also take up some time. John, anything you want to add?
I'm going to be provocative, and shocking. I think this is COP30. The COP process started 31 years ago. I think we got off to the wrong foot, actually. I think we should have started talking about water at the beginning, and I think we should have started talking about adaptation and resilience and all 190 odd signatories in the world, not just like 20 countries that launched the Industrial Revolution process and started emitting large quantities of carbon. And I think the kind of global disorder that we're in right now, it's also present in the UNFCCC itself, and we see a lot of the emphasis on carbon meeting like really kind of uh, enormous stumbling blocks. It certainly the effort hasn't crumbled, but it's become diffused. Things like forest carbon, for instance, like those markets have completely fallen apart over the last 18 months, 2 years. Has nothing to do with any particular administration globally. But the kind of stepping back by many countries because of new concerns over national security or kind of internal economic issues, or just internal political issues for that matter, has also reset a lot of those climate mitigation priorities. And I think in part it's because we were focused so narrowly on a set of topics without really thinking like how do we make sure that the world is really going to be better for our kids in the future? How do we think about fully prosperous economies that are capable of not just being a surface that the waves of big climate change impacts hit us, and we can stand those impacts, but actually we could be a boat, we could be a surfer riding those waves in spite of the impacts of climate change. And so there's a part of me that feels like COP30, it feels like it's part of the I'm not sure if it's the end of book one on climate change, or maybe it's the forward for book two. Um, and so it's an epilogue or it's a forward. And I think that we're transitioning to saying actually we need a fundamentally different approach to how it is that we talk about these issues. And I think that's, to me, the potentially most exciting thing that could be happening. And I think the evidence for it is going to be when we look into these NDCs. And Nepal's, I think, is one of the leading indicators. I think there are a handful of countries that there are these like I don't think that there is a separate economic development strategy for Nepal beyond like what you really see in the NDC at this point. That it is an alignment of resilience with economic development, and that's where we should have started, right? But if it's taken us 31 years to get there, then Godspeed. I hope that's where we keep going.
I think that's a good place to end it. With the forward or the epilogue. But yeah, thanks everybody, and we hope you're having a great meeting today. And like I mentioned before, Danny can answer any questions that you might have. And please feel free to reach out to John or myself. We'll make sure that she shares contact information on the day. So best of luck.
Namaste.